I'm Damon Tweedy, an associate professor of psychiatry here at Duke. I'm joining you on behalf of the Trent Center for the next installment of the Boyarsky series on race and health. So our topic today will be on the life and times of Dr. Aaron Moore. He was Durham's first Black physician and later the founder of Lincoln Hospital, the primary hospital serving Black people in the region for most of the 20th century. To guide us in this discussion, we have the author of a recent biography of Dr. Moore. So we have Blake Hill Saya, a writer and classical musician who joins us from her home in Los Angeles. And we have Eileen Watts Welch, president of the Durham Color Library, which is the sponsoring organization for developing this book. This aunt and niece duo are descendants of Dr. Moore, and through their words today, we will learn about his life and how his contributions inform our present. As we proceed, please use the Q&A feature for questions or comments, and we will try to get to them near the end today as time allows. So before we start this interview portion, I want you to briefly try and envision the world that Aaron Moore was born into. So it's 1863, the Civil War is halfway over, and Aaron Moore enters into a family of farmers, part free Black and part Native American, in eastern North Carolina. At a young age, he developed a thirst for learning that led him to college and then to medical school. And at age 25 in 1888, he became the first Black physician in Durham. In 1901, he became the founder of Lincoln Hospital. But amazingly, he's equally well known for his life outside of medicine as a businessman who in 1899 helped found the North Carolina Mutual and Provident Association, later known as the NC Mutual Life Insurance Company, which for many years in the 20th century was the largest Black-owned business in the United States. So as we are imagining this life, though, we must recognize that it took place amid a vicious post-Civil War racial backlash that characterized the Jim Crow South, a system that remained in place for generations through the mid-1960s. And that story of oppression doesn't end fully there, of course, as this legacy of Jim Crow is something that we still grapple with in our present times. So we're going to spend the rest of our noon hour today focusing on Aaron Moore's life through medicine. So many of you are familiar with the Lincoln Community Health Center, which was been in operation since 1971. It was founded by Dr. Charles Watts, who was Eileen's father and Blake's maternal grandfather. But the story of Lincoln goes back to the beginning of the 1900s. It's a story of establishing something new and different when something that previously didn't exist, and all the grit, perseverance, and collaboration and determination required to make that happen. So to enlighten us today, it's again my pleasure to welcome Blake Hill Saya and Eileen Watts Welch to join us. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Damon. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you today, especially to share our great ancestry with you.
Yes, so thanks again. So why don't we just start with where the medical life really picks up? So because we're going to focus more on his medical. There's so much more we could talk about leading up to that, and it could be its own story, and it is. But we're going to start for the purposes today on the medical side. And so it really begins at Shaw University, it begins in Raleigh, Shaw University, which is still in existence today, and an affiliated medical school that it had that many people here may not know about called Leonard Medical School, which is no longer in existence. But sort of take us through that period where Aaron Moore, his medical life got started.
Well, it was really not a deliberate focus of his. He went to Shaw fully intending to become a teacher at the university level. He had loved learning his whole life and had come up through the teacher training system, through several teacher training schools that we called normal schools at the time. And he was fully intending to pick his education back up and continue on to become the teacher that he was and wanted to be throughout his life. Now that turned out to be still the case, but really a detour on that road happened when he got to Shaw, because Shaw had just matriculated their first class of medical students, 6 students in the first class at Leonard Medical School, and they knew that they needed a really special and very dedicated kind of student, and they saw that. They must have seen that in Aaron Moore when he arrived. There were many requirements to be part of the medical school, but one of the requirements that we might not see as much today, although we see that in our essay application sort of process, but high moral character was definitely part of what they were looking for as a religious institution, because Shaw originated as a religious institution, and because they just knew it was going to be a hard sell anyway to educate young Black men in medicine, and they really needed very serious, very stable, and very willing students who were really going to be dedicated to this new craft they were learning. So I think they must have seen that in him and in the recommendations that brought him to Shaw. Perhaps they took him aside in a room and talked to him about what they hoped for in Leonard medical students, and how much he could benefit his race, in particular through this training, and to be really a pioneer, not only in his race in the field, but also in the field. If you think about it, medicine at the end of the 19th and the turn of the 20th century was really coming into its own in general, both as a regulated practice, but as a scientific practice. And so it was a bit like getting offered a place on, a space shuttle. It was quite an invitation to adventure, and he stepped right in, as he did always in his life when he saw an opportunity to learn.
So let's just put that in context a little bit. When we're thinking about this, Leonard Medical School is a historically sort of Black medical school. There were very few at the time. So this is all developed in post-Civil War. And so Howard was the first, and that was established in the medical school in 1868. And Meharry is also still in existence. Those are the two that are still in existence from the older days. That was established in 1882. So Meharry, which is in Nashville, Tennessee. And so then you have Leonard, which comes along a few years later. So around 1885, I believe, was the first year that it was on board. So tell us a little bit about some of his accomplishments at Leonard Medical School. I want to tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I sort of wanted to read you a short quote from one of the medical students in the first class that graduated while he was there. They were really, the forerunners in that school, and you can imagine that anyone on that campus really looked up to them. And I think it just really describes the dedication of what they were all really embarking on. And at commencement, this is Dr. Lawson Andrews Scruggs, who became really a longtime friend and colleague of Dr. Moore's. He says, with the same self-sacrifice, courage, and devotion as has ever characterized the profession, we who stand before you tonight are pioneers of the medical profession of our race. He then sort of goes on to say that they are harnessing themselves for the battle of the future of Black health, both in the United States and abroad. So that's really how they saw themselves. And so, his accomplishments while he was there in particular were really, he graduated with the Obstetrics Prize, which, if you think about it at the time, midwives were really the most prevalent attendants at the birthing bed, especially in the Black community. And so to be someone who had a talent and a real care for women's health at this time was really quite ahead of his time. It was not the most feminist time period in our history, and it certainly wasn't really a particularly detailed moment in women's medical history. However, that was beginning to coalesce, and so his dedication to women and children and healthy childbirth in particular, and the complications surrounding childbirth and surviving those. We know today that is still a question that's on the table, the survivability of the birthing process in the Black community, and he really dedicated himself to that, and we really saw the evidence of that in his practice going forward.
So another thing that I noted was that he, as a medical student, he co-founded what's called the Old North State, the Old North State Medical Society, which is still in existence, right, to this day. And so, several years ago, when my book came out, that was one of the very first organizations that I had an opportunity to sort of, speak to. And at that point, I didn't know what I was doing, how to give a talk or anything like that. But it was just such a pleasure to sort of, be there and to engage with with that community. And to think that that dates back to his time starting that when he was a medical student. You think 1887, at this time, sort of like the North Carolina Medical Society, the American Medical Association, they barred Black physicians. And so Black people had to sort of create something from their own. And so the Old North State Medical Society actually predates the National Medical Association, which we kind of think of as the sort of the umbrella for Black physicians. So it's really so many ways ahead of his time. So that's really what sort of gave me like a personal kind of connection. But tell us a little about Leonard, medical school. I wanted to just sort of briefly touch on this idea because, it's no longer in existence, right? And we know that the Flexner Report came out in 1910. Yes. And, some years later, and, part of that was sort of out of the Johns Hopkins model of sort of standardizing medical education and things of that sort. And so only 2 of the 7 historically Black medical schools, Howard and Meharry, survived the Flexner Report. But I feel like Leonard is the reading I have is like, Leonard really had a special place and in some ways could have survived it, would have. And so it's always that kind of what if game of what might have been like for all the doctors in education in the Carolinas if it might have, survived. So just tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. The Flexner Report was really, while it was aimed at standardizing medical education, there's no denying that Flexner was a racist and a misogynist, and that he openly held those beliefs that both Black males and women of any race could not and should not learn medicine. And so that was really baked into his, view when he went to review these medical schools. It's also interesting and important to note that he was not himself a physician, nor was he himself a scientist. He was a man who had written a treatise on education and how he wished it had been, like the Platonic and Aristotelian days of ancient Greek education, and that caught the imagination of some of the neoclassicists at the time in government, and they engaged him to do this standardization tour. So, Eileen, did you want to add something?
I do. I just wanted to bring back just one point that Damon referenced, the American Medical Association and the National Medical Association and the Old North State. So the Flexner was hired by Carnegie and the American Medical Association. There was no interaction with African American doctors associations at the time. And the North Carolina, the Old North State could have been connected with, in fact, during that time. It was founded by 4 classmates at Leonard. So when we were, one other thing that I've seen written about the fact that Carnegie funded this report was that if they had only funded improving the education capabilities for those schools that they ended up closing, there would have been more African American doctors being able to be trained even during segregation and Jim Crow era. So instead of seeing a way to fund the doctors who, to give them more access to finance those schools that were having the hardest time, they chose to close those schools. And that was detrimental to the amount of African American care that was given.
Yes, certainly, because during that era, Howard and Meharry basically educated the pretty much all the Black physicians, 85, 90% at least, up and through the mid 1960s. And again, there was clearly a shortage. And you imagine what could have been if there were these other institutions such as Leonard had been in existence throughout that time.
I think it's also important to mention that there was a concern that Black physicians were taking patients from white physicians, that they were in fact too well trained, too skilled. And for instance, if you did not want to encounter in society the white doctor who might have treated you for an illness that you were not comfortable him knowing about, you could go across town and get really excellent care and discreet care in a way that was competing with white physicians at the time, and that was also very much on their minds.
Yes, that's great point. So speaking of, so let's moving forward a little. Let's speak about Dr. Moore. So in 1888 he became licensed. He went through, like, he's one of the early doctors to actually become, because this is very different now. All of us take this for granted now, but he was one of the first folks to get, have that licensure formally. So talk us through that, and then kind of what led him to sort of set up shop in Durham.
Yeah, sure. To just kind of bookend his medical education, he started his medical education the year that they made it possible in the state. It was lawful to dissect a cadaver in North Carolina the year that he began his medical education. And then the year that he finished his medical education was only the second year of state board certifications. So he really stood with many white doctors who had been practicing for quite a long time, who were taking their boards, as well as medical students, and passed quite handily at the top of that class of 42 at that time. So it was definitely a fraught period. They worked very hard. Leonard in particular was very proud of those who passed the boards, both the year before him and his year. It was really a landmark crowing event for Martin Tupper, the head of Shaw. He was really quite proud.
Yeah. So take us through Durham. So take us through, because we build this as in the first Black physician in Durham in 1888. So talk us through that and what that was like for him. And tell us a little bit about that.
So imagine entering Durham at a time where Durham's Black citizens had never seen a Black physician, who many did not know how to react to that. Some thought that perhaps he wasn't very good because he wasn't a white doctor. Some felt that perhaps he was, a thinly disguised root doctor. Some felt that they just didn't know what to think. He was also a young man. I know many young doctors go through this as well as they begin their practice. So if you imagine just how hard it is already to gain patient trust as a physician early on in your career, then imagine being someone that nobody had ever seen the like of before, and to enter a truly chaotic situation of many people really in health duress and under amazing amounts of stress in their working lives. So it was quite a scene. Eileen, do you want to add to that?
Sorry, I should have framed it. So Durham was, sorry to interrupt. So Durham was founded in 1869. So Durham's a post-Civil War town. And so, there's the tobacco industry and other things that sort of starting to sort of take hold. And then there's a Black population that's been building. And so Aaron Moore sort of enters into that space. So sorry, Eileen.
Yeah, I was going to say that at Leonard, he met John Merrick, and we don't want to not mention him in this conversation. John Merrick was at that point a tradesman learning to lay bricks at Shaw University. So when they met, my vision for this, and there's some imagination and some fact, that John Merrick was a very gregarious type person, always making friends, and Aaron Moore was a little bit shy and withdrawn and actually more studious than Merrick. And so they got to be friends, opposites attracting. And Merrick was here in Durham first, and he had barbershops, and he was interacting with the people coming, African Americans who were coming here to work in the tobacco factories and the textile mills. And so he knew the lack of care and the need for care here. And he essentially recruited Moore not to go back to Columbus County, where he came from, which was his plan, but to come to Durham, the new budding city, booming city, actually, at that point, with recently freed African Americans who needed care and weren't getting it and weren't going to get it from the physicians, the white physicians who were here. So I just wanted to add that.
No, that's very helpful context. And Blake, so you described how that first year in Durham was sort of like almost like a combat medic is how I heard you reference it. So talk us through like what it was like for him to be a doctor, the sole Black doctor taking care of this budding Black community. Tell
It's
us.
absolutely true. Yeah, it was, I mean, it was the kind of conditions that you could almost imagine a combat medic entering into. You really, you report, you figure out what the situation is, how safe it is for everybody involved, and then you solve lots of problems, not just the problem that you were called to solve. In many cases, he was observing that there wasn't adequate shelter, there wasn't adequate heat or light or sanitation or food that was of good quality. And so in many cases, he was trying to triangulate all of those services into one doctor's visit around one patient. So he learned, in many ways also he gleaned a tremendous amount of data about what a Black Durham needed, which later on really factored into him understanding how to, contribute to the infrastructure and the entrepreneurship that came later in the Black Wall Street effort. So he really, he would, for instance, if there was a fire, he was the paramedic. He was the one reporting to the scene. He was the one stabilizing the patient. He would also be the one transporting the patient to his own home. Remember, there was no hospital. So if he wasn't treating them in their home, he was very often bringing them to his home where he could control the conditions. And then his dear wife, Sarah Makata Dancy Moore, who was a tremendous woman in and of herself, got quite the amateur education as a new wife of how to sterilize instruments, how to, apply dressings and bandages, how to nurse. Very, very quickly, she was up and running, helping him care for this home hospital kind of outpost. And so, yes, absolutely. Early on, it was a very chaotic situation, both socially, medically, and really just as a new doctor, a new husband, and a new citizen of Durham. Quite amazing.
All right, so those of us in medicine and medical school and residency now and training, we think we have it difficult, but we really clearly have no idea.
The way he entered into Durham was through the church.
Yes.
White Rock Church, which those of you who live here now know there is a White Rock Church. It's way down Fayetteville Street. The White Rock Church, original White Rock Church, is probably buried under the 147 Expressway at this point. So his home was next door to White Rock Church. His second home, actually, right, Blake?
Yes.
Which we discovered during our research. But his wife became a staunch member of that church and lived another 20 years after he passed. During those young years, he was able to convince people and meet people in the community and understand needs from the sort of view of churches, of the members of the church first. And once the confidence was gained by the members trying him out and seeing he attended church and all of those other things that build confidence, then he began to fan out in the community when someone else needed help and have successes that then the word got around, and then he grew his practice. And that is how a lot of doctors begin to enter into a community, in Black communities often.
Can you quickly show us that there was a book you discovered, like his of his first year? It's almost like, I mean, this is pretty corny, but you think about like those Indiana Jones movies and these archaeological digs, and you find this thing. So you guys found this book from his first year in practice. Can you just tell us real briefly about that?
This was truly the most exciting moment in our research process. I really feel like we have uncovered the Rosetta Stone of Black medicine in Durham. I mean, it truly is. So I was able to I was doing a lot of triangular research in other people's papers. And so in his associate, C.C. Spalding's papers, there was a box in the wonderful Rubenstein collection at Duke University Library. And actually, I'll be writing a cover story for their magazine on finding this book. I was able to find this box that just had a label on it that said in the file, Aaron's book. And I thought, well, Aaron was really important to him and contributed to his education and his career and housed him for a good time when he first came to Durham. So I thought perhaps this was that Aaron, but could have been any Aaron, lots of Aarons after him. So I asked my dear aunt if she had some time to go and see what she could find over there. And what did you find?
Well, no, Blake, I was Blake's research assistant with hands-on here at the archival spaces in North Carolina. Anything she couldn't find online or found a nugget about online that maybe the hard copy would be local, then I was out there doing it. And I was finding things, new things that we didn't know about at all from the family sort of history. So I'd been in that box 3 times before, and I had missed it. But online, she could see in the directory that there was this file. I'm like, okay.
Digital archives are so important.
I'm going every folder, and it was bare. It's a smaller folder than the rest of the folders in the box. And so I said, okay, here it is. And I put my hand down there, and I just started shivering. I mean, I was holding something he had held, and it's leather, and his fingerprints and his smell is probably still there. And I'm so anxious for Blake to get back here from California to actually go visit and have that opportunity. I had the librarian take my picture holding it. But Blake actually went through, I was able to scan every page and email those scans to her from the Rubenstein Collection's wonderful scanner. And she was able to analyze it much more closely than I was able to do.
It was an extraordinary record of the first year of his medical practice. And so doctors had a medical book that they would carry where they would record who they saw, what they saw them for, what, if anything, they were paid. In many cases, it was a chicken or a basket of onions or whatever it was that they could spare, if anything. So this was not a lucrative job early on and really for a while. And so you were really able to see how in the beginning of his practice, his handwriting was careful. It was not so many visits. And then by the end of the book, it was like,
yeah, exactly. Right, exactly.
It really took off. So it was, you could see how his practice grew. You could see how people's trust grew. You could see what he was treating people for. Lots of factory related, smoke inhalation. Pellagra was really an issue at this time. Obviously obstetric visits, et cetera, et cetera. So it was really, it was quite moving and really, honestly, historically quite significant that we found this artifact.
Right. And speaking of history, let's put his life in a little bit of context, because there's some things that are happening in North Carolina and elsewhere during this period, which are very serious things that we, that are still legacies we deal with now. And so, so talk us through that. So he ran for office himself, and he faced pretty vicious kind of racial backlash, and that was sort of an eye-opening thing, but in some ways it seemed like that foreshadowed what happened some years later here in North Carolina. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, when he first came to Durham as a fired up young man ready to help, he was convinced by his future father, well, actually not father-in-law, but uncle-in-law, his future wife's very involved politically, Uncle John C. Dancy, and convinced him to run, and also John Merritt, for county coroner. And so this was just a way of him being part of the political structure of Durham as well as a physician. Right. It seemed like a good idea, and the backlash was truly vicious. Some of the papers really took him to task. There were many, many threats on his life, and it was just a very eye-opening moment for him in the sense that he found that politics was really something he did not have a tremendous taste for. If you think of him as a somewhat studious, retiring, quiet deeply caring individual who was more comfortable at the bedside of someone he could help than in a room, shouting slogans.
Right.
This was easy to understand. But I think it also really brought home to him the fact that Black men in office of any kind was really rankling the white public at this time, particularly the Southern Democratic public. And remember, at this time, the Southern Democratic Party was the party of the planter class, the party of the Confederate Southerners, and the Radical Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. This is something that switched, and many people debate when that happened, but Strom Thurmond was certainly part of that. That being said, he really met that moment where he thought, okay, what I want to do with my life is to concentrate on within my community, to concentrate on the health structure, infrastructure, and quality of life of those who I can help. And I'm going to leave this mess to some other folks.
And so just to sort of, for those in the audience, but there was this important election in 1896,
Yes.
and it's something called like the Fusionist movement.
Yes.
If you heard of, people are familiar with Reverend William Barber here, in the Poor People's Campaign here in North Carolina, which has been in the last decade or so. He references that period in history quite a bit, because what happened is that there's this sort of fusion of sort of the poor white class with some of the the Republicans. The Republicans at the time, and so it also, the Republicans, the white Republicans, and the black men who were able to vote that time, and there's this sort of electoral success that they gained. Now, I know I'm not doing a great job explaining that, but I guess what I wanted to lead it up to was sort of how there was a success in 1896, and then what that led to in 1898, because that's really gets us to sort of that next period.
For sure, and I think very simply put, when poor whites and upwardly mobile blacks find common ground,
right,
the minority party in power gets very, very nervous,
right,
and starts resorting to tactics that are violent, suppressive, and disenfranchising.
Right.
That's just the pattern. And I believe that we have seen that roll out of late in several southern states. And so this happened with the Fusionist movement. The Fusionist movement really put the Radical Republican Party in power unilaterally throughout the state, including the governor. And so when we get to 1898, particularly in Wilmington,
exactly,
where we have what's called the Wilmington coup, we had a political insurrection that was successful on American soil, that involved American troops, that involved American citizens killing American citizens in the streets, that involved the takeover and stealing of an election by the Southern Democratic Party, and a near assassination of the governor of the state. And so this is a moment that we're digging back into of late in history because of our recent Capitol insurrection. But it was a very definite white supremacist moment. In fact, they even wrote a white supremacist Bill of Rights and posted it publicly and put it in the paper after the insurrection, after the coup. And so that definitely galvanized Black leaders at the time to turn inward, to do what they could to benefit their own communities, and to apply as much statesmanship to keep people safe as well as thriving as they possibly could.
So I encourage people to read more about the Wilmington history. There's books written about it, and kind of what it means again for the January 6th Capitol, riot, as well as people want to talk about reparations and things. These are the things. This event sort of leads to these kind of sorts of conversations. So it's just something worth people knowing about. Let's bridge it down to how this may have impacted Dr. Moore, and when we're talking about Lincoln and how Lincoln sort of came to be, because this is all happening right around the same time. So because Lincoln is 1901 when Lincoln was founded. So talk us through that. How did Lincoln Hospital come about? We got a sense before he was seeing patients on his own in the community in his house, but it needed something more. So tell us about Lincoln and how they got set up.
You want to take the lead on this one, Eileen?
Yeah. For 12 years, Dr. Moore practiced medicine in Durham without a hospital access. He used his own home. So we often say that the first African American hospital in Durham was actually his home, 606 Fayetteville Street. My grandmother tells stories that Blake wrote about in the book about running across the street on Saturday night to visit neighbors because there was too much blood on the back porch of the house. He would pull teeth, he would birth babies, he was doing all the kinds of things that gunshot wounds, because Durham was kind of a Wild West also then. There were people coming over into Durham for the brothels and the alcohol opportunity from the white side of town. And some were recent Confederate military who have now found a place to come and just rampage. So Moore was caring for this population, and always wanted to have a hospital that he could practice from, because he had access to a hospital over in Raleigh. Leonard and St. Agnes Hospital was there, right? And he stayed in touch with all of his professors and did a lot of work there when he was there. So they needed to raise money in order to have a hospital. They couldn't build it on their own. And Merrick was Duke's barber and had good relationships with the sort of captains of industry here in Durham because of the economic situation. They employed the African American community and needed the African American community as employees. And so they pulled together a campaign with not only Merrick and Moore, but Dr. Benjamin Duke's physician, Carr, who didn't want to care for these patients at Watts Hospital, of course. And so he also was helpful in convincing Duke to help to fund this request. And they heard that there was some philanthropy available because Duke was thinking about creating a monument to put on Trinity College campus, which is now East Campus at Duke, essentially, in honor of the Mammies and their children who cared for the daughters of the Confederacy here when the men were off fighting the Confederate War. I often think now that would have been very similar to Silent Sam, which has been taken away from UNC recently. So just from that perspective, you know that Duke hadn't thought about it all on his own. There was a conscientious effort from the African American community to find funding, and he did finally help. So the first hospital was built in 1901, and Duke and Moore served as superintendent up until 1923, when he passed. And then they built the newer hospital, and also the Duke family lent funding to the newer hospital as well, which was opened in 1924. And that's the hospital I was born in. And my father practiced in, but he didn't come to Durham until 1950. So between 24 and 50, there was an OBGYN, and there were other physicians there. There was a pediatrician. That was viable group of African American doctors who practiced there and served the Black community because there really wasn't anywhere else.
Yeah, so I want to unpack some of that just a little bit more. So just so people in the audience can make sure we're clear. So before Lincoln Hospital in the late 1890s, there was a hospital called Watts Hospital, and that served the white community. And there was a discussion about building a segregated ward on Watts Hospital around this time, after the 1898 period.
And it was written, but it was founded specifically for white people.
Exactly.
In the indenture.
Exactly.
It funded it. George White says for white people,
exactly.
Including only having white people practice there.
Exactly.
No nurses, no doctors, no integration, period. They offered that wing, but it was only for patients to come. not allowing African American clinicians who were practicing, who were willing to come there, but didn't want to go there
Right.
because they wouldn't have had equal status.
Right.
And I think it's important to say that this is where Dr. Moore's statesmanship came across, because he was able to make clear to these folks that let's just talk this through a moment. So what you're saying to me is that I can put a Black male patient in your white ward and he will be attended to by white nurses. That's what we're talking about.
They could put, his only option was to put the Black patient on the back wing that they were going to build for them.
Right.
Not in the white ward, not next to the white patients.
Oh, of course, right.
And then
Right.
the white doctor would go back there and take care of them when he had time.
Right.
Right.
They didn't like the understanding. The understanding was that they became immediately uncomfortable with white doctors, giving care in a hospital setting, and perhaps white nurses caring for Black patients. And so that became one of the main drivers that Dr. Moore talks about, putting very gently but succinctly that was going to be possibly the case, and that maybe pushed them over the edge.
Right, and to circle back to the Duke family, because this is Trent Center, Duke, and everything. So the gist I get is it's certainly complex, right? Because on the one hand, the Duke family, Washington Duke, and Benjamin and James Duke, there are these sort of they call radical Republicans at the time. So they're in some ways they're at odds with sort of the Jim Crow, the harsh, the worst of the Jim Crow Southern Democrats. So on one hand, they're more progressive. Certainly, but then on the other hand, there's this sort of complexity, right? Because their idea of sort of celebrating Black people from the era was to sort of build a statue of women who took care of, women who were sort of honored the Confederacy, for lack of a better word.
Loyal.
Loyal, right? So there's a historical kind of complexity to it.
And so women, it was mammies. That's the way it was written.
Yeah, that's exactly that.
And their children, which is also condescending.
Yes, sure, absolutely, absolutely.
When you just say women, it waters down the harshness of what he was intending to do from an African American perspective.
Sure.
You're absolutely right. They took, as a family, they took a tremendous amount of danger on their shoulders socially. They themselves received death threats. They did sponsor a radical Republican paper in town, which took a lot of flack, particularly around 1898 and that election. So they took risks for their time. They were progressive for sure, and they did have, I think, an interest in what was going on. But I do think it's important to put their interests in context.
Exactly.
And a good deal of their interests were, a healthy, skilled labor force that was, that took care of themselves and that didn't put too much weight on the shoulders of the white community.
Right.
But then, by that time, there was a middle class, African American middle class here, who were working at the Mutual, who were coming here because of the blossoming middle class that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about. So when the African American educated middle class interacted with the Dukes, it was on even ground pretty much until they started to ask for things that might rile people who felt threatened. So the Dukes played that game between the two, and were respectful and came through, but did not think of it at first.
And many people credit that level of statesmanship with the fact that Durham did not meet the fates of Tulsa and Wilmington.
That's right.
Yeah, and that's a question that people often ask. Why didn't what happened to Durham happen? What happened to Wilmington or Tulsa happened in Durham? But so I wanted to bring that out.
That teetered on the balance of a knife point in many, many cases, right. And I believe truly that diplomacy was what brought that through.
So let's move things forward to because the relationship between Duke and Lincoln and Moore, it doesn't end with the founding. It sort of evolved over time, and Lincoln became a training place over the years, and there's this collaboration between Duke and Lincoln. I'd like to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, that the training place happened. Lincoln became a training place in the 50s when my father came to Durham and became the first African American board certified surgeon, Dr. Charles Watts. He, in about 3 years, became chief of surgery there. And if you know, surgeons love to have residents, right? And Lincoln was not a training or a teaching hospital. So he was able to reach across the railroad tracks and talk with a friend he had made, Dr. Eugene Stead, who at that point was chief of surgery at Duke, about helping him to find a way to have residents. He had trained residents also when he was at Howard, where he became a resident and stayed and was trained some residents and had relationships back with with doctors at Howard. It was not Dr. Drew. Dr. Drew had died by then, but they were able to work out an arrangement with Howard that Howard would allow their residents to come through Duke to be trained by Dr. Watts at Lincoln, which was very unorthodox. They could not be trained at Duke because there weren't any.
Still segregated.
It was still segregated, and Dr. Watts couldn't be on staff at Duke.
Right.
Oh no, but they trusted him to train not only the Black residents who came through Howard, but also residents of Duke, white residents. And it is written, Dr. Bill Anlian, who Duke North is named after, who was Chancellor of Health Affairs at Duke at one point, wrote in his memoirs that he was trained by my dad at Lincoln. He had a call one day. He tells his story. I won't tell it, but he authenticates that he was extended his training from Duke to Lincoln under my father. So yes, that's how it happened. And then Duke became a training hospital. While and often the first Black physician to be on staff at Duke, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Charles
Johnson, yes,
came to Durham, was trained by Dad, and then became the first staff at Duke, African American staff.
Yeah, often think of the lineage here that Dr. Moore made Dr. Drew possible, Dr. Charles Drew possible, and Dr. Drew made Dr. Charles Watts possible. And now we're very proud to still have some physicians in our family moving forward. So that's the lineage through the generations there.
And you mentioned Charles Johnson. I worked with him when I was a trainee as a medical student. I certainly don't put myself in anywhere near the historical importance of any of these people, but it's just an honor to be just even a small part connected in that way. So it's really cool to sort of hear that connection.
Lineage includes you.
The first OBGYN at Duke actually also came through Lincoln, and his name was Dr.
Moore, exactly.
Don Moore, but
Donald Moore, exactly.
Not a relative.
Exactly. So we don't have a lot of time to delve into some of the other pieces, but I know that ultimately Lincoln Hospital, Lincoln Hospital and Watts Hospital, after desegregation in the 60s, eventually we led to what's Durham Regional Hospital. And so, but then out of that,
and that was a lot of community discussion about that. Dad was on a lot of those discussions, and one thing he used to say, has said to me many times, was they wanted to put, again, rather than open a general hospital, Durham Regional at that point, they wanted to put a wing onto Watts again.
Right.
And he said to me, I told him no. I told him no again. And I told him hell no. And as a community leader, they listened to him. And then they began to talk jointly about how to move the patient bed rights, is the way you do it, into the general hospital and close Lincoln and then keep the buildings of Watts Hospital and turn them into the School of Math and Science.
Right.
And then Dad realized that he could see the writing on the wall, that there would not be this neighbor this community hospital in the African American community any longer. And most patients from the African American community would even go to Lincoln for primary care. They, like now, you really don't want them showing up in the ER, but that's often what they were doing. So he had heard of this opportunity for funding across the country for creating community health centers, and he was able to have join and have a grant written to fund Lincoln Community Health Center, which opened in 1972. And at first it did open in the Lincoln building because the patients and the actual hospital care had moved to Durham Regional.
Right.
And they used that building at first until they could raise funds to build the Lincoln Community Health Center, which he felt so great about. I mean, that was the legacy. He often said, I could help more patients that way than I could one surgery at a time.
And he felt very, very strongly about retaining Dr. Moore's footprint in the community as well. Like he really felt that he was traveling in those footsteps.
Right.
And that Lincoln Community Health Center was something that was an offshoot of what Dr. Moore really stood for. And so I think that's also important to see that lineage as well.
So just so we have enough time for a few questions, there's another section I did want to cover. I'll just kind of briefly kind of summarize. So like Dr. Moore, just to go back to Dr. Moore, when we think about sort of his influence more broadly, I mentioned at the outset about the life insurance company and how important that was, and it's this term called Black Wall Street. It was so well known that he was into circles with people like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. So like when people think about the 1960s, you think about, people think about Dr. King, we think about Malcolm X. And so these are sort of these kind of historical figures. Well, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington were sort of that for that period of time in the early 20s, and in your book, you talk about his correspondence and travels and things like with them. So I encourage folks, we don't have time to go into it, but I think it's an interesting history for those of you who want to learn more about it. It just gives you a sense of sort of his broader impact nationwide to think about
it's often
in that space.
Chapter of civil rights that people forget and leave out and don't emphasize as much. And Dr. Moore really stood kind of between the philosophies of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois in a way that made his interface with them really fruitful and collegial.
Yes. And so let's go to a couple questions. And so one question I see here, and I'm just curious about, it says there's a bronze plaque recognizing the Duke donation in Lincoln Hospital. That thing that you described was still in the lobby of Durham Regional until the 1980s. And it says, but I do not know what became of that plaque after it was removed. In your research, did you locate it? And secondly, can you comment on Dr. Moore's relationship with Dr. Clyde Henry Donnell? So
Dr. Clyde Donnell is my cousin, my aunt's husband.
Okay.
He married John Merrick's baby daughter,
Okay.
Martha Merrick Donnell, and he did have, he was an educated physician, had time at Harvard, came to Durham after marrying her and was the medical director for North Carolina Mutual during his time. I think he also practiced chiropractic. He was a chiropractor, if that's the way to say it,
Okay.
but also a trained African-American physician. And I know that there is a book written about him and some films about training
Okay.
African-American physicians.
Also, Dr. Donnell, it's important to know that Dr. Donnell was actually his personal doctor at the end of his life.
Okay.
Right. He was Moore's
Okay.
doctor.
Oh, good. So that's so good. So let's hope that answers that person's question. And about the plaque, do you know what happened with that plaque? That's
Yeah,
sort of somewhat infamous.
It's in the it's in the archives at Durham Duke Regional at this point. There's something that they had a foundation for better health.
Okay.
And it was kept within those documents. And actually, I have a picture of it I can share with you if you want.
Yeah. Someone here mentioned about the Flexner report and something about their understanding of it and thinking about how they can learn more about it. I mean, I can tell you that there's been a lot written about it in the world of academic scholarship. I don't know if I have a specific thing I'd recommend, but there's plenty of things that you can sort of find about it. You can actually read the report itself. Did you have anything, Blake, that you would recommend as far as someone wanting to know more about the Flexner report?
I would recommend you reading the report itself, but I also I think that the work of Todd Savitt, just on
Yes.
race and medicine in general,
Mhm.
is extraordinary and was really foundational for my work. So anytime you can check in with him is a good time.
Yes. And so someone wondered about the ancestral connection. So basically, Dr. Moore was your great grandfather, Eileen. Is that right?
Yes, he's my mother's maternal grandfather, and John Merrick that I mentioned is my mother's paternal grandfather.
Right.
So her parents were Lada Moore Merrick and Ed Merrick. And Blake is my sister's daughter.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the connection. So I wanted to ask you, sorry, go ahead, Blake. I'm sorry.
Two greats for me. Great for me. Great grandfather.
Exactly.
And just great for.
So it's been 100 years almost, because Dr. Moore died in 1923. So it's been nearly 100 years since he died. So what do you think we can take from, his lessons today? Because we learned a lot about his life. We covered a lot. What do you think what's some of the things you think we can take home? We've mentioned several, but I want you to tell me some things.
Well, I just keep thinking, the more things change, the more things stay the same. And the lesson is that we need to continue to remember history. We've gone from an age of the lynchings to the age of shootings of Black men. And now we really need to take, and this is the mission of the Durham Colored Library that Dr. Moore actually founded, that is not really a library anymore. We are doing this kind of work. We're focusing on creating a more comprehensive picture of the American experience, publishing. So more information about from Blake's excerpts from her book and expanding on some pieces of the book are in our magazine that is on our website that people can read freely. So it's fortifying our children and gaining an understanding of the broader open-minded communities, figuring out how to have an effective strategy for the future. And it seems just talking and learning and being open.
And I will just say that healthcare is a human right. And Dr. Moore understood that. Dr. Moore understood that giving people hope, health, the hope that they could thrive, build a legacy, and have the infrastructure that could hold that legacy so that they could be whole and fully participating citizens in what we call the American dream, but we haven't quite made that dream available to all. And so he truly believed in that and lived that dream and tried with all of his might till his dying breath to build that dream for others of his race.
Yeah, there's this term we call, social drivers of health or social medicine that we hear about nowadays. And in some ways, it seems like that's very much what he lived.
Yes.
Throughout his practice in so many ways. And I know we only gave short shrift to all of his contributions outside of medicine. There's much more to learn in terms of his work in education, with the library, as he talked about, with the world and sort of that business model, that he did. And so there's so much more. So I encourage folks to hear, there's the book again, take a look at that, read more, because, you can only cover so much in a concept of an hour. And we really focus on the medical side, but there's a really full life. One that I think can give us a lot of insight into, where we've been, the issue lessons that we've experienced, and how we can move forward. I think these are all really important things. So I want to just, leave it here.
Before, look, it's the one, we're gone.
No, go ahead. Final point, go ahead.
The Library Fest, we did an interview which focused on his educational impact. And we will be putting those two, this one and that one, on the Durham Colored Library website for those who have been able to miss that one and would like to see more of this one.
So I want to just thank both of you for your time. Thank you, Blake. Thank you, Eileen. It's been a pleasure to be part of this and be a small part of being part of this larger story. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate you too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you, everyone.
And thank you, all of you who are healthcare givers and future healthcare givers, for being part of this important story of health in this country.
Exactly.
You guys have a good day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan.